हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। आज के वीडियो में हम बात करेंगे हेनरिक एप्सन के प्ले अ डॉल्स हाउस के बारे में। प्ले को डिस्कस करने से पहले जान लेते हैं प्ले राइट के बारे में। चलिए अब प्ले राइट के बारे में डिस्कस करते हैं। हेनरिक इब्सन, considered by many to be the father of modern prose drama, was born in Skien, Norway on 20th March 1828. He was the second of six children. Ibsen's father was a prominent merchant, but he went bankrupt when Ibsen was 8 years old. So Ibsen spent much of his early life living in poverty. From 1851 to 1864, he worked in theatres in Bergen and in what is now Oslo, then called Christiania. At age 21, Ibsen wrote his first play, a five-act tragedy called Catiline. Like much of his early work, Catiline was written in verse. In 1858, Ibsen married Susanna Thoresen and eventually had one son with her. Ibsen felt that rather than merely live together, husband and wife should live as equals, free to become their own human beings. This belief can be clearly seen in his play A Doll's House. Consequently, Ibsen's critics attacked him for failing to respect the institution of marriage. Like his private life, Ibsen's writing tended to stir up sensitive social issues, and some corners of Norwegian society frowned upon his work. Sensing criticism in Oslo about not only his work but also his private life, Ibsen moved to Italy in 1864 with support of a traveling grant and a stipend from the Norwegian government. He spent the next 27 years living abroad, mostly in Italy and Germany. Ibsen's early years as a playwright were not lucrative, but he did gain valuable experience during this time. In 1866, Ibsen published his first major theatrical success, a lyric drama called Brand. He followed it with another well received verse play, Peer Gynt. These two works helped solidify Ibsen's reputation as one of the premier Norwegian dramatists of his era. In 1879, while living in Italy, Ibsen published his masterpiece, A Doll's House. Unlike Peer Gynt and Brand, A Doll's House was written in prose. It is widely considered a landmark in the development of what soon became a highly prevalent genre of theatre realism, which strives to portray life actually and shuns idealized visions of it. In A Doll's House, Ibsen employs the themes and structures of classic tragedy while writing in prose about everyday and exceptional people. A Doll's House also manifests Ibsen's concern for women's rights and for human rights in general. Ibsen followed A Doll's House with two additional plays written in an innovative realistic mode, The Ghost in 1881 and An Enemy of the People in 1882. Both were successes. Ibsen began to gain international recognition and his work were produced across Europe and translated into many different languages. In his later work, Ibsen moved away from realistic drama to tackle questions of psychological and subconscious nature. Accordingly, symbols began to gain prominence in his plays. Among the works he wrote in the symbolist period are The Wild Duck and Hedda Gabler. Hedda Gabler was the last play Ibsen wrote while living abroad. In 1891, he returned to Oslo. His later dramas include The Master Builder 1892 and Little Eyolf 1896. Eventually, a crippling sickness afflicted Ibsen and prevented him from writing. He died on 23rd May 1906. चलिए प्ले A Doll's House को डिस्कस करते हैं. A Doll's House opens on Christmas Eve. Nora Helmer enters her well-furnished living room, the setting of the entire play, carrying several packages. Torvald Helmer Nora's husband comes out of his study when he hears her arrive. He greets her playfully and affectionately, but then chides her for spending so much money on Christmas gifts. Their conversation reveals that the Helmers have had to be careful with money for many years, but that Torvald has recently obtained a new position at the bank where he works that will afford them a more comfortable lifestyle. Helen the maid announces that the Helmer's dear friend Dr. Rank has come to visit. At the same time, another visitor has arrived, this one unknown. To Nora's great surprise, Christine Linde, a former school friend, comes into the room. The two have not seen each other for years, but Nora mentions having read that Mrs. Linde's husband passed away a few years earlier. Mrs. Linde tells Nora that when her husband died, she was left with no money and no children. Nora tells Mrs. Linde about her first year of marriage to Torvald. She explains that they were very poor and both had to work long hours. Torvald became sick, she adds, and the couple had to travel to Italy so that Torvald could, could recover. Nora inquires further about Mrs. Linde's life, and Mrs. Linde explains that for years she had to care for her sick mother and her two younger brothers. She states that her mother had passed away, though, and that the brothers are too old to need her. Instead of feeling relief, Mrs. Linde says she feels empty because she has no occupation. She hopes that Torvald may be able to help her obtain employment. Nora promises to speak to Torvald and then reveals a great secret to Mrs. Linde without Torvald's knowledge. Nora illegally borrowed money for the trip that she and Torvald took to Italy. She told Torvald that the money had come from her father. For years, Nora reveals she has worked and saved in secret, slowly repaying the debt, and soon will be fully repaid. Krogstad, a low-level employee at the bank where Torvald works, arrives and proceeds into Torvald's study. Nora reacts uneasily to Krogstad's presence, and Dr. Rank, coming out of the study, says Krogstad is more morally sick. Once he has finished meeting with Krogstad, Torvald comes into the living room and says that he can probably hire Mrs. Linde at the bank. Dr. Rank, Torvald, and Mrs. Linde then depart, leaving Nora by herself. Nora's children return with their nanny. Anne, Mary, and Nora play with them until she notices Krogstad's presence in the room. The two converse, and Krogstad is revealed to be the source of Nora's secret loan. Krogstad states that Torvald wants to fire him from his position at the bank and alludes to his own poor reputation. He asks Nora to use her influence to ensure that his position remains secure. When she refuses, Krogstad points out that he has in his possession a contract that contains Nora's forgery of her father's signature. Krogstad's blackmail Nora, threatening to reveal her crime and to bring shame and disgrace on both Nora and her husband if she does not prevent Torvald from firing him. Krogstad leaves, and when Torvald returns, Nora tries to convince him not to fire Krogstad, but Torvald will hear nothing of it. He declares Krogstad an immoral man and states that he feels physically ill in the presence of such people. Act 2 opens on the following day, Christmas alone. Nora paces her living room filled with anxiety. Mrs. Linde arrives and helps sew Nora's costume for the ball that Nora will be attending at her neighbor's home the following evening. Nora tells Mrs. Linde that Dr. Rank has a mortal illness that he inherited from his father. Nora's suspicious behavior leads Mrs. Linde to guess that Dr. Rank is the source of Nora's loan. Nora denies Mrs. Linde's charge but refuses to reveal the source of her distress. Torvald arrives and Nora again begs him to keep Krogstad employed at the bank, but again Torvald refuses. When Nora presses him, he admits that Krogstad's moral behavior isn't all that bothers him. He dislikes Krogstad's overly familiar attitude. Torvald and Nora argue until Torvald sends the maid to deliver Krogstad's letter of dismissal. Torvald leaves. Dr. Rank arrives and tells Nora that he knows he is close to death. She attempts to cheer him up and begins to flirt with him. She seems to be preparing to ask him to intervene on her behalf in a struggle with Torvald. Suddenly, Dr. Rank reveals to Nora that he is in love with her. In light of this revelation, Nora refuses to ask Dr. Rank for anything. Once Dr. Rank leaves, Krogstad arrives and demands an explanation for her dismissal. He wants respectability and has changed the terms of the blackmail. He now insists to Nora not only that he be rehired at the bank, but that he be rehired in a higher position. He then puts a letter detailing Nora's debt and forgery in the Helmer's letterbox. In a panic, Nora tells Mrs. Linde everything, and Mrs. Linde instructs Nora to delay Torvald from opening the letter as long as possible while she goes to speak with Krogstad. In order to distract Torvald from the letterbox, Nora begins to practice the tarantella she will perform at that evening's costume party. In her agitated emotional state, she dances wildly and violently, displeasing Torvald. Nora manages to make Torvald promise not to open his mail until after she performs at the party. Mrs. Linde soon returns and says that she has left Croxted a note but that he will be gone until the following evening. The next night, as the costume party takes place upstairs, Krogstad meets Mrs. Linde in the Helmer's living room. Their conversation reveals that the two had once been deeply in love, but Mrs. Linde left Krogstad for a wealthier man who would enable her to support her family. She tells Krogstad that now that she is free of her own familial obligations and wishes to be with Krogstad and care for his children. Krogstad is overjoyed and says he will demand his letter back before Torvald can read it and learns Nora's secret. Mrs. Linde, however, insists he leave the letter because she believes both Torvald and Nora will be better off once the truth has been revealed. Soon after Krogstad's departure, Nora and Torvald enter back from the costume ball. After saying goodnight to Mrs. Linde, Torvald tells Nora how desirable she looked as she danced. Dr. Rank, who was also at the party and has come to say goodnight, promptly interrupts Torvald's advances on Nora. After Dr. Rank leaves, Torvald finds in his letterbox two of Dr. Hank's visiting cards, each with a black cross above the name Nora knows. Dr. Hank's card constitutes his announcement that he will soon die, and she informs Torvald this fact. She then insists that Torvald read Krogstad's letter. Torvald reads the letter and is outraged. He calls Nora a hypocrite and a liar and complains that she has ruined his happiness. He declares that she will not be allowed to raise their children. Helen, that brings in a letter. Torvald opens it and discovers that Krogstad has returned Nora's contract, which contains the forged signature. Overjoyed, Torvald attempts to dismiss his past insults, but his harsh words would have triggered something in Nora. She declares that despite their 8 years of marriage, they do not understand one another. Torvald, now Nora asserts, has treated her like a doll to be played with and admired. She decides to leave Torvald, declaring that she must make sense of herself and everything around her. She walks out, slamming the door behind her. चलिए अब कैरेक्टर को डिस्कस करते हैं नोरा हेल्मर at the beginning of a doll's house Nora seems completely happy. She responds affectionately to Torvald, speaks with excitement about the extra money his new job will provide and takes pleasure in the company of her children and friends. She does not seem to mind her doll like existence in which she is coddled, pampered, and patronized. As the play progresses, Nora reveals that she is not just a silly girl, as Torvald calls her, that she understands the business details related to the debt she incurred taking out a loan to preserve Torvald's health indicates that she is intelligent and possesses capacities beyond mere wifehood. Her description of her years of secret labor undertaken to pay off her debt shows her fierce determination and ambition. Additionally, the fact that she was willing to break the law in order to ensure Torvald's health shows her courage. Krogstad's blackmail and the trauma that follows do not change Nora's nature. They open her eyes to her unfulfilled and underappreciated potential. I have been performing tricks for you, Torval, she says. During her climatic confrontation with him, Nora comes to realize that in addition to her literal dancing and singing tricks, she has been putting on a show throughout her marriage. She has pretended to be someone she's not in order to fulfill the role that Torvald, her father, and society at large have expected of her. Torvald's severe and selfish reaction after learning of Nora's deception and forgery in the final catalyst for Nora's awakening. But even in the first act, Nora shows that she is not totally unaware that her life is at odds with her true personality. She defies Torvald in small yet meaningful ways by eating macaroons and then lying to him about it. For instance, she also swears, apparently just for the pleasure she derives from minor rebellion against societal standards. As the drama unfolds, and as Nora's awareness of the truth about her life grows, her need for rebellion escalates, culminating in her walking out on her husband and the children to find independence. Torvald Helmer. Torvald embraces the belief that a man's role in marriage is to protect and guide his wife. He clearly enjoys the idea that Nora needs his guidance, and he interacts with her as a father would. He instructs her with trite, moralistic sayings such as a home that depends on loans and debt is not beautiful because it is not free. He is also eager to teach Nora the dance she performs at the costume party. Torval likes to envision himself as Nora's savior, asking her after the party, "Do you know that I have often wished you were facing some terrible dangers so that I could risk life and limb, risk everything for your sake?" Although Torvald seizes the power in his relationship with Nora and refers to her as a girl, it seems that Torvald is actually the weaker and more childlike character. Dr. Rang's explanation for not wanting Torvald to enter his sick room: "Torvald is so fastidious, he cannot face up to anything ugly," suggests that Dr. Rang feels Torvald must be sheltered like a child from the realities of the world. Furthermore, Torvald reveals himself to be childishly petty at times. His real obligation to working with Krogstad stems not from deficiencies in Krogstad's moral character but rather Krogstad's overly friendly and familiar behavior. Torvald's decision to fire Krogstad stems ultimately from the fact that he feels threatened and offended by Krogstad's failure to pay him with proper respect. Torvald is very conscious of other people's perception of him and of his standing in a community. His explanation for rejecting Nora's request that Krogstad be kept on at the office, that retaining Krogstad would make him a laughing stock before the entire staff, shows that he prioritizes his reputation over his wife's desire. Torvald further demonstrates his deep need for society's respect in his reaction to Nora's deception. Although he says that Nora has ruined his happiness and will not be allowed to raise the children, he insists that she remain in the house because his chief concern is saving the appearance of their household. Krogstad is the antagonist in a doll's house, but he is not necessarily a villain, though his willingness to allow Nora's torment to continue is cruel. Krogstad is not without sympathy for her. As he says, even moneylenders hacks well. A man like me can have a little of what you call feeling. He visits Nora to check on her and it discourages her from committing suicide. Moreover, Krogstad has reasonable motives for behaving as he does. He wants to keep his job at the bank in order to spare his children from the hardships that come with the spoiled reputation. Unlike Torvald, who seems to desire respect for selfish reasons, Krogstad desires it for his family's sake. Like Nora, Krogstad is a person who has been wronged by society, and both Nora and Krogstad have committed the same crime, forgery of signatures. Though he did break the law, Krogstad's crime was relatively minor, but society has saddled him with the stigma of being a criminal and prohibited him from moving beyond his past. Additionally, Krogstad's claim that his immoral behavior began when Mrs. Linde abandoned him for a man with money so she could provide for her family makes it possible for us to understand Krogstad as a victim of circumstances. One could argue that society forced Mrs. Linde away from Krogstad and thus prompted his crime. Though society's unfair treatment of Krogstad does not justify his actions, it does align him more closely with Nora and therefore tempers our perception of him as a despicable character. Mrs. Linde represents the variety of ways that women can live fulfilling lives independent of their husbands. Mrs. Linde acts as a foil to Nora, providing a serious contrast to Nora's frivolous personality and highlighting the spoiled life Nora leads. Mrs. Linde, like the hundreds of thousands of women that Nora points out to Torvald, led a self sacrificing life in order to help her loved ones. First, turning down Krogstad's proposal in order to marry a wealthier man and help her ailing mother and younger brothers, then working long hours once her husband's finances failed. By working so much, Mrs. Linde learned how to become a self sufficient woman, something of an anomaly in her time, causing genteel society like Torval to find her boring. Because of the hardship she endured for much of her life, Mrs. Linde describes herself as becoming bitter, and since she is obliged to be always on the lookout for chances to survive, she calls herself selfish, yet her action says otherwise. And according to her own philosophy, deeds you must believe in. When Nora describes how Torvald has just been promoted to bank manager, Mrs. Linde confesses that her first thought was how she might land a job through this connection. Yet, Mrs. Linde uses the eventual job offer to save Crockstead, the man she once truly loved and never forgot. The job offer also places Mrs. Linde in the interesting position of being both the breadwinner of her future family and a motherly figure for Krogstad's children. Her days are filled with work to keep her mind occupied while also enabling her to provide for others. The two things she craves above all, her reunion with Krogstad and her insistence that Torvald reads Krogstad's letter, shows that she truly understands the honesty and respect necessary for the real wedlock that Nora describes at the end of the play. Dr. Rang, both Nora and Thorvald claim that Helmer household would not feel complete without the presence of Dr. Rang. Dr. Rang, for his part, is happy to be a fixture in both their home and their marriage. Nora and Thorvald have their own idealized pictures of each other and treat the other accordingly. Torval thinks Nora is flighty, delicate, and entirely reliant on him. Nora thinks Torval means well, but that he secretly needs her to survive. Dr. Rank sees them both in a much clearer light, and he shows the audience deeper insights into their character. During the events of the play, Dr. Rank reveals that he has come to admire and eventually love Nora, although she already suspected it. This declaration makes her uncomfortable. Dr. Rank is more attentive to Nora than her husband is, but she prefers Dr. Rank's attention to fill in Torval's gaps rather than to replace him when he is with both Helmers. Dr. Rank jumps in to help or speak up for Nora where he can. Nora transposes his attitude on to Thorvald, particularly when it comes to the two men's reactions to her death. Dr. Rank immediately offers to pay the money she needs and take legal responsibility for her mistake. Because Dr. Rank does so, she assumes Torval will as well, even though Dr. Rank's actions towards Nora are consistent throughout the play. She sees them as an extension of Torvald until Dr. Rank tells her he loves her. After that point, she cannot pretend Dr. Rank is a stand in for Torvald. Torvald seems ignorant of Dr. Rank's feelings for Nora. He is willing to deceive himself as much as possible to see his life as an idyllic success story. Dr. Rank realizes this flaw in Torvald and he does his best to play along with Torvald's ideas and shield him from any unpleasantness. Dr. Rank tells Nora he will not allow Torvald to see him on his sick bed because he does not think Torvald can handle witnessing illness or death. Saving Torvald's reputation is also part of that reason Dr. Rank offers to pay for Nora's loan. He knows how poorly Torvald would react to Nora's decision, so he hopes to protect them both from it. Early in the play, Nora tells Mrs. Linde that Dr. Rank is chronically ill. She knows he inherited his illness from his father's overintelligence in physical pleasures and vices, but she's surprised that his illness serious enough to kill him. Dr. Rank's illness frightens Nora because she worries about what consequences her own children could suffer from her decisions. While Nora's failures are moral rather than sexual, she still worries that, like Dr. Rank, her children could inherit her own misdeeds. Dr. Rank, on the other hand, seems somewhat resigned to his condition. He struggles with existential questions like his place in the Helmer household after he is gone, but he has given up attempting to prevent his death. Although he is not at peace with dying, he feels it is inevitable when Dr. Rank confirms his dying and removes himself from their lives. Nora and Torvald find themselves at odds almost immediately. They take a moment to mourn his loss, but they are more concerned with their own problems and quickly move on. Dr. Rank, even in death, operates as a character who reveals the true shallowness of Torvald and Nora. Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie is Nora's former nursemaid, the nanny of her children, and the only real mother figure she ever knew. Anne-Marie is kind, soft-spoken, helpful, and amenable. Everything a woman in this time was expected to be. She embodies the selflessness from beginning to end, always making herself available to Nora. As the play progresses, we learn that this selflessness is not simply surface level and is actually far more self preservational than is initially obvious. She had to give up her own child in order to take the job offered by Nora's father. Annie marries a French character, bobbing in and out, caring for Nora's children, shielding them from witnessing the turmoil and dread Nora finds herself in. She acts in many ways as the glue that keeps Nora's world from completely falling apart. However, while she's an aid to Nora in the running of her household, she is also a constant reminder to Nora of how desperately her children want her, amplifying the war within herself over her obligation to be a good woman versus wanting to feel like she is her own person with real agency. Anne Mary's character is minor, but is used to more thoroughly establish the reality of the world that women are required to forfeit more and stand to gain much less than their male counterparts. Women must often exchange their agency, individualism, personal interest, and even their family for financial security and social protection. Because Anne Mary fills the role of the ideal female archetype, there is very little we know about her on an individual level. We know that she loves Nora and her children, and she had to give up her own family to avoid financial ruin. We don't know much else. This omission is intentional. Ibsen has included the character of Anne Mary to amplify Nora's feelings of being trapped, personifying the very real treats and sacrifices that plague the female sex, causing her to come face to face with the reality of her situation and the awful lack options. The lack of options available are in many ways the bricks that built this doll's house. Nora's father is dead before the story begins but exists at the center of its most important plot of point. He was on his deathbed when Nora forged a signature which allowed her to borrow the money she needed to save Torvald's life. Initially, this plan worked, but as Krogstad's position at the bank is threatened upon Torvald being given a management role, he finds that the contract was signed and dated after Nora's father's death, leading him to the discovery that the IOU was fraudulent and a perfect way to blackmail Nora. The picture Nora paints of her father is that of an absent man who provided for her material needs but did not take the time to teach her about the ways of the world or equip her with tools needed to hold any kind of independence. While Nora has genuine feelings of love and devotion for her father, it becomes increasingly clear as time goes on that she also blames him for the situation she finds herself in. This blame creates feeling of resentment within her as she recognizes that she was not seen as a full person in the eyes of her father. Rather, she has lived her life as a beautiful doll, first to her father and now to her husband. Ibsen's inclusion of Nora's father in the play's narrative helps us to understand some of the more traditionally male social roles of the time and how they aided in creating a society in which women held virtually no power. Themes: the sacrificial role of women. In A Doll's House, Ibsen paints a bleak picture of the sacrificial role held by women of all economic classes in his society. In general, the play's female characters exemplify Nora's assertion, spoken to Torvald in Act 3, that even though men refuse to sacrifice their integrity, hundreds of thousands of women have, in order to support her mother and two brothers. Mrs. Linde found it necessary to abandon Krogstad, her true but penniless love, and marry a richer man. The nanny had to abandon her own children to support herself by working as Nora's children's caretaker. As she tells Nora, the nanny considers herself lucky to have found a job since she was a poor girl who had been led astray. Though Nora is economically advantaged in comparison to the play's other characters, she nevertheless leads a difficult life because society dictates that Torvald be the marriage's dominant partner. Torvald issues decrees and conditions to Nora, and Nora must hide her by loan from him because she knows Torvald could never accept the idea that his wife or any other woman has helped save his life. Furthermore, she must work in secret to pay off her loan because it is illegal for a woman to obtain a loan without her husband's permission. By motivating Nora's deception, the attitude of Torvald and society leave Nora vulnerable to Krogstad's blackmail. Nora's abandonment of her children can also be interpreted as an act of self sacrifice. Despite Nora's great love for her children, manifested by her interaction with them and her great fear of corrupting them, she chooses to leave them. Nora truly believes that the nanny will be a better mother and that leaving her children is in their best interest. Parental and filial obligations. Nora Torvald and Dr. Rank each expressed the belief that a parent is obligated to be honest and upstanding because a parent immorality is passed on to his or her children like a disease. In fact, Dr. Rank does have a disease that is the result of his father's depravity. Dr. Rank implies that his father's immorality, his many affairs with women, led him to contract a venereal disease that he passed on to his son, causing Dr. Rank to suffer for his father's misdeeds. Torvald voices the idea that one parent's determine one's moral character when he tells Nora nearly all young criminals had lying mothers. He also refuses to allow Nora to interact with the children after he learns of her deceit for fear that she will corrupt them. Yet the play suggests that children too are obligated to protect their parents. Nora recognized this obligation, but she ignored it, choosing to be with and sacrifices herself for her sick husband instead of her sick father. Mrs. Linde, on the other hand, abandoned her hopes of being with Krogstad and undertook years of labor in order to tend to her sick mother. Ibsen does not pass judgment on either woman's decision, but he does use this idea of a child's death to her parent to demonstrate the complexity and reciprocal nature of familial obligations. The unreliability of appearances over the course of a doll's house appearances prove to be misleading veneers that mask the reality of the play's characters and situations. Our first impressions of Nora, Torvald, and Krogstad are all eventually undercut. Nora initially seems a silly, childish woman, but as the play progresses, we see that she's intelligent, motivated, and by the play's conclusion, a strong willed, independent thinker. Torvald, though he plays the part of a strong, benevolent husband, reveals himself to be cowardly, petty, and selfish when he fears that Krogstad may expose him to scandal. Krogstad too reveals himself to be a much more sympathetic and merciful character than he first appears to be. The play's climax is largely a matter of resolving identity confusion. We see Krogstad as an honest lover, Nora as an intelligent, brave woman, and Torvald as a simpering sad man. Situations too are misinterpreted both by us and by the characters. This seeming hatred between Mrs. Lynde and Krogstad turns out to be love. Nora's creditor turn out to be Krogstad and not as we and Mrs. Lynde suppose. Dr. Rank and to Nora's and our surprise confesses that he's in love with her. The seemingly villainous Krogstad repents and returns Nora's contract to her, while the seemingly kind-hearted Mrs. Linde ceases to help Nora and forces Torvald's discovery of Nora's secret. The instability of appearances within the Helmer household at the play's end results from Torvald's devotion to an image at the expense of the creation of true happiness. Because Torvald craves respect from his employees, friends, and wife, status and image are important to him, and he disrespect when Nora calls him pretty and when Krogstad calls him by his first name. For example, angers Torvald greatly. By the end of the play, we see that Torvald's obsession with controlling his home's appearance and his repeated suppression and denial of reality have harmed his family and his happiness irreparably. The constructive nature of gender roles in a doll's house. Ibsen portrays a stereotypically gendered household with Torvald and Nora Helmer, and then shows how characters, both male and female, suffer because of the roles society expects them to play. The constructive nature of gender roles is especially apparent for the main female characters in the play. Nora and Mrs. Linde, women at this time, were expected to get married, have children, and stay at home to tend their children and husband. When a woman actually had a job and earned money like Nora Co-op, being lines and secret, it was like being a man. Women had very few opportunities to make money for themselves and had to rely on husbands or fathers to provide for their needs. Without a father or older brothers, Mrs. Linde sought a rich husband, leaving behind a man she truly loved in order to be financially secure. But even this plan was risky because she had no way of knowing his true financial situation. When Nora asked whether the man Mrs. Linde married was rich at the time, Mrs. Linde can only say that she believed he was. Because of the expectations to stay home, raise children, obey their husbands, women missed out of many opportunities, often needing legal consent from their husbands to perform simple business matters. By the end of the play, Nora recognizes the destructive nature of these gender roles, telling Torvald that he and her father, by enforcing societal expectations of her, are the reason she has made nothing of her life. The men in the play also suffer, albeit more subtly and unknowingly, because of the gender roles they actively uphold. Though Torvald clearly enjoys his role as an enforcer of societal expectation, he doesn't realize that he can't fully love his wife because he doesn't truly see her as a person of his manly independence. He can't receive help from anyone else, especially not a woman, and Nora therefore decides that it's better to lie to her husband than to wound his pride. Most importantly, Torvald's inability to break free of societal gender roles leads to his failure to recognize that the love of his wife is more valuable than his reputation. As a result, he loses Nora and will ultimately become the very thing he feared most, the subject of gossip as a failed man. Deceit. Throughout the doll's house, deceptions are presented as masks that the liar must wear in order to conceal the truth. When Torvald describes why Krogstad has a bad reputation, he explains that Krogstad did not take his punishments head on but got out of the conundrum by a cunning trick, and now, because of his lies, he must wear a mask in the presence of those near dear to him, even before his own wife and children. That ever present mask is even more clearly worn by Nora. In front of Torvald, she wears the mask of a little girl or innocent woodland creature, willing to play along with his dehumanizing nicknames of Squirrel and Skylark in order to get the things she wants. The mask world provides another instance when a mask is necessary to keep others from the truth. Nora dresses up as a Neapolitan fisher girl and dances a wild tarantella in order to distract Torvald and keep him from reading Krogstad's letter, which tells the truth of Nora's loan and forgery. To maintain that deception, a person must be willing to hide their true self underneath a mask, and the more desperate they are to conceal the truth, the more likely it is that their mask becomes permanent. Reputation. For both Nora and Dr. Rand, their reputations hinge on the reputation of their parents. Dr. Rang's father had a reputation as a man who enjoyed physical pleasures to such a damaging extent that he passed on a venereal disease to his son that eventually results in his son's death. Though Dr. Rank is an upstanding member of society, he is punished for his father's misdeeds and pays the ultimate price for his father's ill repute. Likewise, Torvald says that Nora's ability to wheedle money out of him is in the blood, and in Torvald's eyes, she has inherited her father's reputation as a careless spender. When Torvald discovers the truth about The loan and forgery further declares that Nora's want of principle is all her father's influence. Interestingly, at the beginning of the play, Torvald introduces the idea that it is most commonly the mother who is a bad influence on children, claiming that almost everyone who has gone to the bad early in life has had a deceitful mother. According to Torvald, a person's reputation should be inherited through the mother, yet throughout the play, the opposite is shown to be the case. Just as a child in this society receives their father's last name as their own, they also seem to inherit their father's reputation, especially when it comes to negative traits. If their fathers had a bad reputation, it comes back to haunt them, regardless of any goodwill they may build up on their own. In this way, Ibsen subtly points out the poisonous influence of misogyny in the society. Marriage. Nora and Thorvald represent a completely conventional marriage at the beginning of the play. She stays home and tends to their house and children, and it supports the family financially in order to keep their conventional marriage afloat. Nora lies to Thorvald at every turn. She's not dishonest about silly things like eating macaroons, but all about enormous things as well, like the fact that she secured the loan that saved Torvald's life. When these lies come to light, Torvald completely breaks down and drives Nora away. Torvald, as the conventional husband, feels that he has the right to control his wife. He's astonished when Nora says that it's nice of her to do what he wants. This perceived right to control is another reason for their marriage falls apart. Towel must control every aspect of his household, even the keys to the letterbox, but he fails to realize that his control comes at a price. As long as he exerts control over Nora, they can never be equals and thus cannot be in true union or relationship. In contrast, the relationship between Krogstad and Mrs. Linde, while unconventional, represents the real wedlock that Nora desires. By the end of the play, Mrs. Linde's role as breadwinner of the family is highly unusual, but it gives her the agency to earn money and the opportunity to live part of her life outside the home. Furthermore, Mrs. Linde and Krogstad can speak frankly to each other, something Nora and Torvald find impossible until their marriage falls apart, meaning that they don't have to hide behind contrived marital roles. They see each other as equals, two shipwrecked people joining forces because they actually respect each other as equal human beings. Their union allows them to grow, change, and become better people. Motives. Nora's definition of freedom. Nora's understanding of the meaning of freedom evolves over the course of the play. In the first act, she believes that she will be totally free as soon as she has repaid her debt, because she will have the opportunity to devote herself fully to her domestic responsibilities. After Krogstad blackmails her, however, she considers her conception of freedom and questions whether she is happy in Torvald's house, subjected to his orders and edicts. By the end of the play, Nora seeks a new kind of freedom. She wishes to be relieved of her familial obligations in order to pursue her own ambitions, beliefs, and identity. Letters. Many of the plot twists and turns depend upon the writing and reading of letters, which function within the play as the subtext that reveals the true unpleasant nature of situations obscured by Torvald and Nora's efforts at beautification. Krogstad writes two letters. The first reveals Nora's crime of forgery to Torvald. The second retracts his blackmail threats and returns Nora's promissory note. The first letter, which Krogstad places in Torvald's letterbox near the end of Act 2, represents the truth about Nora's past and initiates the inevitable dissolution of her marriage. As Nora says immediately after Krogstad leaves it, we are lost. Nora's attempt to stall Torvald from reading the letter represent her continued denial of the true nature of her marriage. The second letter releases Nora from her obligation to Krogstad and represents her release from her obligation to Torvald. Torvald attempts to return to his and Nora's previous denial of reality, but Nora recognizes that the letters have done more than expose her actions to Torvald. They have exposed the truth about Torvald's selfishness, and she can no longer participate in the illusion of happy marriage. Dr. Rang's method of communicating his imminent death is to leave his calling card marked with the black cross in Torvald's letter box. In an earlier conversation with Nora, Dr. Rang reveals his understanding Torvald's unwillingness to accept reality when he proclaims, Torvald is so fastidious, he cannot face up to anything ugly. By leaving his calling card as a death notice, Dr. Rang politely attempts to keep Torvald from the ugly truth. Other letters include Mrs. Linde's note to Krogstad, which initiates her life changing meeting with him, and Torvald's letter of dismissal to Krogstad. Torvald's pen name for Nora. Torvald rarely addresses Nora by name, preferring instead to give her a host of pet names. Most frequently, he calls her Skylark or a variety of other birds related terms. He also addresses her by descriptions of her behavior, usually behavior he does not approve of, in a condescending sense of endearment. More often than not, Torvald also tacks the word little in front of whatever name he uses. This behavior is Torvald's way of showing affection for and ownership over his wife, and he takes every opportunity to indulge it. Nora initially sees this attention as kind and loving. However, most of Torvald's praise is directed either at Nora's appearance or his possession of her. He delivers admonishments playfully but plentifully, cloaking his criticisms with pet names. This repetition of affectionate belittlement of Nora reminds the audience of the difference in power within the Helmer household. Torvald truly believes he cares for Nora, but his words reveal his care is based on a position as his property. Symbols. The Christmas tree. The Christmas tree, a festive object meant to serve a decorative purpose, symbolizes Nora's position in her household as a plaything who is pleasing to look at and adds charm to the home. There are several parallels drawn between Nora and the Christmas tree in the play, just as Nora instructs the maid that the children cannot see the tree until it has been decorated. She tells Torvald that no one can see her in her dress until the evening of the dance. Also, at the beginning of the second act, the Nora's psychological condition has begun to erode. The stage directions indicate that the Christmas tree is correspondingly disheveled. New Year's Day. The action of the play is set at Christmas time, and Nora and Torvald both looked forward to New Year's as the start of a new, happier phase in their lives. In the new year, Torvald will start his new job, and he anticipates with excitement the extra money and admiration the job will bring him. Nora also looks forward to Torvald's new job because she will finally be able to repay her secret debt to Krogstad. By the end of the play, however, the nature of the new start, that new year's represents her for Torvald, and Nora has changed dramatically. They both must know become new people and face radically changed ways of living. Hence, the new year comes to mark the beginning of a truly new and different period in both their lives and their personality. Nora's Tarantella dance. When Nora tells Torvald that she's leaving him, she focuses on her position in her family as Torvald's tall wife. Nora Tarantella routine is one of many examples in the play that emphasizes the apt description. Torvald not only chooses Nora's costume for the party, but he also directs exactly how she must dance while wearing it. This dance shows the audience a new, near literal example of Torvald treating Nora as his doll. He does not physically put her into the costume or move her around the dance floor, but his instructions are so specific as he may as well have. Nora rebels against her doll like status by deviating from Torvald's dancing instructions in rehearsal. At the party itself, she dances a bit too naturalistic for Torvald's taste. She uses costume fittings and dance rehearsals as excuses to keep Torvald from interrupting her secret conversations with Mrs. Linde and Krogstad, even as Torvald creates the dance scheme to fulfill his fantasy of complete ownership over Nora. Nora uses his expectations to begin hiding from and rebelling against him. Through the dance, we can see both Nora's place as a doll in her home and the way she works to circumvent that role. थैंक यू। आई होप आज की वीडियो आपको पसंद है। कैसी लगी हमें कमेंट करके बताएं और हमें ये भी कमेंट करके बताएं कि आप आने वाले वीडियोस किस टॉपिक पर देखना चाहते हैं। अगर वीडियो अच्छी लगी तो लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू माय चैनल। मिलते हैं कल एक और इन्फॉर्मेटिव वीडियो के साथ शाम 4 बजे। थैंक यू।